Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you folks, I have a brand new Dungeons & Dragons video, and this one was another one that was actually requested by one of my viewers. I got discussing a medieval wartime economy within a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, and someone actually brought up the interesting question about discussing medieval logistics during essentially a medieval wartime campaign, if you will. So that's what we're diving into today, folks. Going to be taking time to dive into logistics because things can really turn up on their heads when kingdoms go to war with one another. And all kings, princes, dukes, basically anything anybody half a brain, even in the medieval time period, understood that wars could be won and lost, or is won and lost, based on logistics. And even today, logistics remain very important within warfare. But really quick here, folks, before I dive into more about the meat and potatoes and logistics and the whole 9 yards, I want to just take time and thank everyone who's been watching, tuning in for their support, the likes, the comments, the subscriptions, the shares. All that helps me out as a growing YouTube channel. It gets my content out there for more people to see and maybe implement this stuff into their tabletop gaming campaigns, if you will. With that being said, I also do have a Patreon page, and I want to give my Patreon supporters a special shout out. They provide additional support for the channel, provide the channel a little bit of a budget. And for anybody who'd be interested in doing something like that, there's a link down below in the video description. Anyway, folks, now let's get into it. And the first thing I really want to get into is during the medieval period, the primary methods of moving amounts of cargo, especially for wartime consideration, would have been wagons and carts and buggies, things of that nature, things that can be used to haul around as much cargo as possible. You're not just going to have some guy in the woods, on the road with a backpack full of stuff. It's going to be people with wagons and that. And this is going to be more so the case even against boats, although boats would have been used to move around cargo. I'll get into that in a little bit here. But basically, the primary source of moving cargo around would have been wagons. And these wagons would have actually formed series of trains to move around cargo. So it would have been just one wagon, although that's possible. But that also leaves that one wagon susceptible to various things, which I'll get into in a little bit as well. So these supplies would have been moved with a series of wagons. They essentially would have formed a train of wagons and carts and things of that nature to move around these supplies to the military encampments from wherever the supplies is hailing from. Now, while they're not just moving supplies that was paid for by the military or by the king or by the duke, that would have been their primary thing they would have been moving. They also would have been moving around other things, such as goods that could actually be sold to the soldiers themselves, such as various cuts of meat, baked goods, things of that nature, as well as they also would have been moving around tradesmen. Tradesmen were definitely really important when it comes to a military campaign, and basically you would have maybe a wagon that is like a blacksmith and maybe his apprentice or his journeyman that would actually be moving maybe swords that they had built. And they're just not moving the stuff that was already paid for by the king. They're also moving stuff that wasn't necessarily paid for by the king, maybe such as maces that soldiers could actually barter for or pay for. They would also have some equipment that they could provide their services for, such as armor repair, or maybe they could do sword sharpening, things of that nature. Also, cobblers was another one that was actually pretty common among these baggage trains, because obviously everybody wore shoes, so cobblers was also another important thing. And of course, within the realm of combat, modern boots, combat boots, holds up pretty well, but at the time the shoes did a pretty good job, but they weren't as made realistically as purpose built as they are now. And they weren't, the shoes at the time wasn't necessarily as rugged as what we have now. So shoe repair was another thing that would be important. Also, soldiers being able to buy shoes. And of course, at this time, military personnel, well, soldiers, would not necessarily actually be provided shoes. They would actually buy shoes. They would have to provide their own shoes. So selling shoes actually would have been pretty common as these trains arrived to the encampments. Now, from what I can understand, looking at medieval Europe in particular, the military itself really did not have a heavy hand in moving around cargo themselves. They relied heavily on civilians to move around cargo. That being said, it's not necessarily outside the realm of possibility that military soldiers, for whatever cane or kingdom, duke, baron, etc., would be actually paid to deal with moving around logistical supplies. And the military has always had at least a light hand in moving around logistical supplies. But towards the tail end of the medieval period, where militaries are getting more uniformed, where they're getting more professionalized, that's when the militaries would start getting more involved in the military handling its own logistical needs. Now, another thing these these baggage trains would actually be moving, and this is more or less after they have dumped a bunch of supplies, is actually wounded. They would actually return to their place of origin with wounded troops. And that was actually pretty common way that wounded troops was actually moved around, was actually using the baggage trains to actually do such. Now, these trains would actually be susceptible to attack, especially smaller trains and lightly guarded trains. They'd be obviously bandits would be a big one. Another one that would also come up even is opposing military forces because they understood the importance of these logistics, as well as, well, they could use the supplies themselves for their own forces. So it was quite important for opposing military forces. If they found baggage trains and it's not like their baggage train, to actually attack the baggage train, just because of it. One, it cuts enemy supplies. Two, it provides them supplies as well. Now, of course, another thing that was kind of a problem for these baggage trains as well is, well, robber barons. Robber barons, once again, it's a very similar thing where basically it comes down to robber barons are more or less just bandits, realistically. Now, sometimes maybe the robber baron would actually negotiate a deal where maybe the baggage train would provide supplies or give supplies over, and they'd be free to go, which probably was pretty common. Money would be another thing that would be traded for passage. But essentially, it's based on the robber baron's mood. He might just decide, yeah, we'll just kill them all and take their supplies, or we'll negotiate, try and get some supplies out of this deal and let them be instead of, putting ourselves at risk, essentially, which might come as an interesting thing for your players to do. Maybe they work for a robber baron, if you will, in your D&D campaign. Now, of course, I wouldn't be remiss to not mention this, as this is a D&D video, but of course, goblins and orcs. Wait a minute. These are the wrong orcs. Hold on a second. There we go. That's much better. Orcs would also be a threat to the baggage trains as well, and probably more likely than not. Now, of course, they would see the baggage train and they would kind of weigh in. What's the value of the train? Can we get more than we're going to lose out of it? They're not just going to attack a baggage train willy nilly, especially if they see it's heavily defended. But obviously, they would be a threat. Now, other things such as dragons, I mean, they could be a threat to a baggage train, but probably not really, as they most dragons would probably do things like just avoid, contact in general, as well as other creatures. But I would definitely argue goblins and orcs, especially a massive war party or war band, would definitely be a threat to your baggage trains. Which, of course, this brings up the importance of secure roads, and of course, the use of these secure roads would be costly. They would actually have to pay to use the roads, and of course, that would also mark up how much their goods are going to be. So keep that in mind when your baggage train stops in the military encampment and they're selling their various wares that they have available, that these wares are going to be marked up in price because it's costing them more to deliver these goods. Besides the fact it's also taking time out of their shops, which is also costing them shop time, business time, if you will. Now, when it comes to security itself, there's a couple different ways that would have been dealt with, I believe. One of those would definitely be mercenaries. They would hire their own security. Another great thing that your players could be doing in the campaign to make money, they could be working as security for a baggage train. Mercenaries would be one thing. Another thing that baggage trains would also do to help kind of cut back on the cost of hiring additional mercenaries for security would be actually moving with military reinforcements. So that's another way that these goods would actually be moved around, or when they would move these goods around. More commonly than not, probably with actual reinforcements themselves, because essentially then the military force that they're providing their goods and services for is essentially now the security for those goods and services. Now, I did mention a bit ago about other methods of basically providing supplies to your militaries, uh, as well as moving around goods. I'm going to get into that here. Now, the first thing I want to talk about lately is raiding. If there's a military encampment and one force is attacking an opposing force, and the opposing force is like in a castle, so they're getting ready to set up a siege and whatnot, they're going to raid the local town for any supplies that they can. Because, hey, it's free, it's enemy territory, etc. So why not raid the place and get as much as you can out of it? Another thing that militaries may do is also rely on smuggling. However, this is not going to be a primary way for military units to get supplies. However, this might be the primary way a military will get certain types of contraband, if you will, or things that they just can't get. Maybe this is a good way for them to get gunpowder. So there's something else that you might be able to use in your D&D campaign for your players to do. Now, another method that supplies could be used is obviously by ship or by boat, rafts, etc. If there's waterways that they can use to move supplies, they will definitely use those waterways because it's a cheap, quick, and effective way for supplies to be moved around. Of course, that can raise problems in itself, especially when it comes to dealing with security. Now, the last thing I actually want to take, or getting towards the end here, but one thing I want to discuss too is supplies being moved through during the winter. This was quite difficult. And while they did fight wars in the winter in the medieval period, they generally tend to avoid doing so. And more often than not, if a military campaign was going to go over the winter, usually enemy forces would pretty much just kind of dig in and kind of set up little shacks or cabins or whatever. Sometimes military forces, and this is probably a more common one, military forces would just completely pull out. They would just kind of postpone the campaign. They would maybe kind of a truce or a ceasefire, if you will. But even still, if the military campaign does go over the winter and you decide it's going to go over the winter, keep in mind that supplies and getting supplies is going to be a bit more difficult because of things such as snow and ice is going to just make travel more difficult in itself. And then the final bit of when it comes to logistics I want to discuss about is the castle siege. And mostly I want to take a look at it from the standpoint of the defender, because, well, it's going to be harder for castles to actually get supplies when they're surrounded by the enemy. Obviously, the enemy is doing anything and everything within its power to prevent any supplies from getting to a castle they're laying siege to. And usually the easiest way to do that is to set up a defensive line all the way around the perimeter of the castle. However, with that being said, this is another good opportunity to lend in a little bit of smuggling into your D&D campaign, because actually castles would be heavily reliant on whatever supplies that they have available within the walls of the castle. But a prolonged campaign, they might get to the point where they start relying on smuggling to actually get supplies into the castle itself. So that might be something you can use. Anyway, folks, I got a whole lot of background noise going on outside, so I think I am going to wrap this video up at that. I've essentially covered everything I want to, or at least I believe I did, but hopefully this all gives you guys some ideas of different things you could do if you want to, per se, do a more military campaign and focus on the logistics side of a militarized campaign within your Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Anyway, folks, thank you very much for tuning in. Hopefully you all enjoyed it, and have yourselves a wonderful day.